This is Jerome Corsi, and today is Monday. It's April 10th, 2023. This is Easter Monday. I wish everyone still a very blessed Easter season. He is risen. This is the most glorious time of the year for Christians, and Christianity remains under attack. And I think that's fairly horrible to have happen in the United States, but the radical left seems to be very, very opposed to Christianity, which is pretty shocking. We're going to cover a variety of subjects today. The major theme today is that the world is seemingly headed into war. It's a fairly frightening theme, and I want to start off with some issues of gold and silver, because we're going to find that these are really one of the measures that I'm watching very carefully. I think we're going into a serious economic decline right now. I think we're going to see inflation is continuing and economic activity is dropping off. I'm very concerned about both the commercial real estate and the residential real estate markets. I think we have far too much credit by federal government. Now is $30 trillion in debt, our national debt, which means the debt service itself is very tough to master. I guess we get into this modern monetary theory, just print a little coin, $30 trillion, and say you're paid off. But that really doesn't cut it. It's, again, inflationary. We're not able to stop printing money. What the story today about is that the world reserves, the world currency reserves, are just right now showing a massive increase of central bank buying. The central banks seem to be just determined to continue buying gold and silver. The report out of February from the World Bank, actually the World Gold Council, showing that since 2010, the central banks began every year net buying gold. And January and February of this year look like 2023 is the strongest year of central bank buying of gold going back to 2010. So that's now getting to be 13 years ago. And the central banks are seeing that the currencies, these fiat currencies, are not going to be sustainable very long into the future. I think the dollar has a great chance of crashing. The gold holdings of Russia, a couple of things are pretty alarming here. Russia's gold holdings are now 24% of Russia's foreign reserves. And I've been reporting on this now for some time. Russia going to say they want all of the purchases of natural gas and oil from Russia to be in rubles, pretty much demands that countries buy gold and deal with Russia through buying rubles with gold. The idea of the Russia getting a gold-backed currency, I think, is very possible. And Russia seems to understand that the economic strength of Russia depends on being able to move away from the fiat currencies and be in control of its own currency. That's something we don't seem to be conscious of. China also has increasing its gold reserves. China's gold reserves have risen since about January and February. It's the fourth consecutive month in which their gold reserves have risen, growing by about 102 tons over that period of time. And it's a lot of gold buying. Again, one of our sponsors, which is Swiss America, and my producer Chris, if you'll show Chris, if you can quickly, the gold offer. I mean, we have basically a walking silver dollar, walking silver half dollar coined. It has a great value in terms of the silver content. It's on our sponsors on the Truth Central homepage. You go into the sponsors and you pull down Swiss America. You can get the offer on you can buy, I believe, up to 250 of these, basically what the silver is worth. There's not much of a premium. It's kind of a lost leader for Swiss America, but it's a introductory one-time offer. And I do think you should get some gold. The currency you've got right now, the dollars, are increasingly not worth the paper they're printed on. And pretty soon we may have them printed at all. If we go to the central bank digital currency, I really recommend you get something tangible, something you can hold that is money. When the electricity goes off, what are you going to do to find your central bank digital currency? So again, and I think having gold is right now very, very important. And I'm encouraging people to contact Swiss America. Now let's switch into the other stories I'm really talking about today, which are the war stories going around the world. Let's pick up this first one here, which is essentially Iran has begun a multi-front war against Israel. Now, this is not getting very much reported in the United States, but over recent weeks, Israel's had rocket attacks from Lebanon, the Gaza Strip, and Syria. Lebanon, of course, is to the north of Israel, and Israel is a very small country, been there many times, and Syria is to the east, the northeast of Israel, and very close. I mean, the Gaza Strip is right there on the Israeli, right with the border with Israel. And so therefore you've got a easy range from Lebanon, Syria, and the Gaza to launch rockets into Israel. Now, what's being reported today in the Jerusalem Post is that there may be different groups behind these attacks, such as Hezbollah, which is largely in Lebanon, the Islamic Jihad, which is more of a radical group that is in the Middle East. The Israelis are Shiites. That's separated from the Sunnis. The Shiites believe that the leadership of Islam should be from the family of the Prophet Muhammad. So basically, you're finding that Israel is under attack by surrogate terrorist organizations that are funded and backed by Iran. And even if the groups are Sunni, Iran is willing to support them. That's, for instance, Hamas. Hamas in the Gaza is a Sunni organization. But Israel basically is willing to work with Hamas in the Gaza and Hezbollah in Lebanon. They've done this for decades. They supply them with financial support, and they're now giving them longer range rockets and a larger arsenal of rockets. The Hamas rockets used to be only able to travel a few kilometers. Now the Hamas rockets from Gaza can reach virtually any part of Israel. So when you see the ramping up of war between these various Iran-backed surrogate terrorist organizations and Israel, I've been warning about this. I've written 3 books on Iran, and I've been predicting we will have a massive war between Iran and Israel. And it could be, biblically. My books refer to Ezekiel, when Ezekiel's talking about what certainly seems like a nuclear exchange between Israel and Iran. And the Ezekiel passages say God intervenes to save Israel. And of course, biblically, once the Jewish state of Israel was reestablished, which happened under Harry Truman in 1948, the Bible strongly suggests that Israel will not disappear. But the Bible doesn't promise we won't have a nuclear war. Now, I'm going to stop here for a second. And Chris, my producer, you want to comment on both the gold story and Iran and what we're beginning to see here?
Well, what I can tell you, Jerry, is it's funny to watch the U.S. pull farther away over the last century from the gold standard into overly political currency situations like the Federal Reserve. Obviously, what happened in 1971 brought people like Dr. Ron Paul into politics. We talked about that several times. But taking that from there, when you hear places like Swiss America or other financial advisors talking about buying gold and buying silver and buying platinum, the idea is the countries that are trying to overtake America at this point as world powers, like Russia, are are looking into going towards gold and away from a sort of let's say politicized currency. This is something that, as I said, I'm not a great financial person, but I will tell you this: it's interesting how we're getting weaker and they're getting stronger, and a lot of this has to do with currency and value.
Well, in 1971, Richard Nixon took us off the gold standard entirely, and the dollar has lost about 99% of its purchasing power since 1971. And the reason gold is appreciating, and gold has been trading at and challenging $2,000 an ounce, is because gold is going to become more valuable as we enter what I think is going to be a very deep recession, maybe one of the deepest we've had in the post-war period. The combination here of all the debt, what's going on in the energy crisis with the green movement trying to prevent us from using hydrocarbon fuels, all of these various forces, I think, are going to throw us into a very strong tailspin, and it will be tough to recover from it. The world is also moving away from using the petrodollar. We reported that China is now making deals to let countries buy their oil and natural gas in yuan, which is China's currency, instead of in the dollar. And again, these are moves which I think are going to weaken the United States. So let's go back to the website, The Truth Central. And I want to continue with some of these stories because it's not only Israel that's now in increasing, I think, probability of having a war, but over the weekend, there was also activity with China and Taiwan. Now, again, this did not get very much reported in the United States, but the Chinese have been running a series of war games in which they have been seeking to seal off Taiwan. In other words, they can encircle Taiwan with naval ships. They have air power and superiority. They can fly over Taiwan with helicopters, with jets, with anything they want in terms of really attacking Taiwan. After 2 days of exercises, this is what's being written here today in the China attentions from, this is from one of the international publications, RFI, and it says that China simulated sealing off Taiwan on a third day of war games around the self-ruled nationalist island of Taiwan on Monday, and which is, again, remember, we're already, since the sun rises in the east, what we basically have is we've got the Pacific Ocean experiencing Monday way before we do. And so if you're ever in Australia or any part of that part of the Pacific, you're basically, we're in New York, we're waking up when they're going to sleep. So China basically launched these exercises in response to Taiwan's president meeting with U.S. House Speaker Kevin McCarthy last week. And on these 2 days of exercises, including targeted strikes on Taiwan and the encirclement of the island, Chinese military said the war games were intended to show you could have an aerial and naval blockade, which would isolate Taiwan from being able to receive any assistance from the outside. The United States sent a destroyer, guided missile destroyer, into the South China Sea. I'm not sure that's going to do anything but be a token statement to China. But again, I believe that what we're going to have soon, I think, is that Taiwan is going to be taken over by China just as Hong Kong was. And I doubt very seriously that the world will intervene. Now, there's movement in China and Congress to say, well, if China attacks Taiwan, we would send troops on the ground. Well, it's nice to talk about that. But if you know the Pacific at all, the Pacific is twice as large as the Atlantic Ocean. One of the problems, even in World War II, to start, is the enormity of the Pacific Ocean. So we couldn't defend the Philippines very easily at the start of World War II just because it was too distant. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, they also attacked the Philippines and Indonesia. And it was just too distant for us to even think about providing any aid to General MacArthur, who was at that time trying to defend the Philippines. Basically, Japanese took over the Philippines and MacArthur left. He returned later in the war, but it took almost 3 years before we were able to do anything to get to the Philippines again. When we deal with Taiwan, Taiwan in 1949, there was a civil war in China. This is when Mao Zedong took over, and the Chinese nationalists fled to Taiwan. So Taiwan has been nationalist ever since 1949, and they are not under the rule of the communist Chinese. Hong Kong was a British colony and was supposedly sovereign to Great Britain until Great Britain just a few years ago gave Hong Kong back to China under the agreement that China would allow it to stay free. Well, that lasted about 20 minutes. And recently, in the last few years, China has now completely taken over Hong Kong. If you remember, there were demonstrators in the streets with American flags in Hong Kong begging us to intervene. We didn't. And I doubt that we'll intervene very seriously again in Taiwan. But this could kick off a broader war, because now we've got violence that we're showing you is going on both in Israel, ramping up, and in Taiwan, which China is, at any moment, China could take Taiwan if they wanted to, or make a move to take China. It's Taiwan. It's just up to China when they want to do it. Now, at the same time, the third article I want to cover here on the war issue is Russia. Again, over the weekend, this really got to be publicized from the Russian television, where you had statements being made. Russia's foreign minister, who is Sergei Lavrov, said in statements on Russian television that were released last week, he said, basically, we are really in a hot phase of a war because the Ukrainian Nazis are fighting mostly with U.S. weapons. Now, what he's referring to is that the western part of Ukraine has, for going back generations, been dominated by Germany. And in World War II, the western part of Ukraine was very, very strongly allied with Nazi Germany and Hitler, including persecuting Jews. The eastern part of Ukraine is Russian. So this Donbass and all these other areas in the east are Russian-speaking, whereas in the western Ukraine, there's a lot of German-speaking population. And so basically, when he says Ukrainian Nazis, when Lavrov is saying Ukrainian Nazis, there are neo-Nazi brigades and battalions that are, in fact, openly with Nazi symbols. This is what Zelensky's army is, and we are supplying them now, Biden administration, with weapons, tanks, and other weapons, and increasingly higher powered weapons. Now, this is a proxy war. In Vietnam is a proxy war too. What a proxy war means is that in Vietnam, we were really fighting China. China was supplying and supporting North Vietnam. But again, China was not involved directly in the fight, and the United States was not involved directly against China. We were supposedly only trying to defeat the North Vietnamese. But again, North Vietnamese were communists. They were allied with China. The world understood that this was a proxy war with China, between the United States and China. It's the same thing with Russia and Ukraine today. We're supplying Ukraine to fight Russia. Russia understands that we're really at war with them. It hasn't been declared yet. It's a proxy war. It could very easily tip over into being a hot war. And as more and more weapons are supplied, we're coming into the spring. There's going to be a spring offensive. The Ukrainian casualties have been underreported, and the Russian losses have been overreported. Russia has basically had a draft of soldiers. Russia has now beefing up its army, and China's beefing up its army. So I see these are three areas of the world. And when you realize that Iran, Russia, and China have formed an alliance, we have three powers who are deadly against the United States at this moment, all of which, and China, with just about, has through its elite capture program, which means they buy leaders of other countries with very little money, really. China is very strongly influencing the Biden administration, and our politicians seem to be much more aligned, including Republicans like Mitch McConnell, whose wife is Chinese, Lane Chao. Her family is worth millions in China, and anyone who knows anything about China, the only reason that family's still alive is because China believes that Elaine Chao could influence her husband, Mitch McConnell, to be favorable to China. And anyone who doesn't understand that doesn't understand the brutality and how these countries operate in the East and Far East. Japan did the same thing. If soldiers didn't return, Japanese-born, in World War II from Hawaii to go back to Japan to fight for Japan, Japan killed the families in Japan. So again, we're facing the same kind of issue with three countries aligned who are very dangerous. It's not really happened since World War II, when Hitler and Japan formed an Axis power with Italy. And that became the basis, started in 1939, for World War II, which we were not involved in until December 1941 when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. But what you see is, again, like in World War II, there was a work up to the war where Hitler was first coming in and taking over the Sudetenland and then Czechoslovakia, and little by little, he was preparing to attack Poland. And even when Hitler attacked Poland, the United States sat out and watched it. It was a European affair. Americans really did not want to get involved. We had enough with World War I. That type of situation is developing again. And we're seeing it happen very fast in terms of both China and Iran realizing they can test out their weapons in Ukraine. And so you've got the Iranians with drones, you've got the Chinese with various of their weapons supplying Russia. And Russia's currency is strengthening because of the embargo that Western Europe, EU placed on Russia as one of the economic penalties for getting in the war with Ukraine. At the same time, Russia's benefited from this because Russia's found other markets for its oil and natural gas, including India and the BRIC countries. And the BRIC countries are also buying massive amounts of gold from gold reserves for their central banks. Chris, you want to comment on this? Take you a second here.
I'm in here. Actually, I was listening very hard to what you were discussing about China, and I again, you were discussing what happened with Elaine Chao and her family while they're still alive for obvious reasons, as you're stating here. It's amazing you bring that up because I was watching a television program on NTD television, and I do have some sound for you that you might want to hear. There was a panel. This included reporter Chuck Holton, who discusses how the CCP actually weaponizes immigrants who come into the U.S. Depending on, it doesn't matter which level of power, because they have families back home. This was more about Latin America and into the U.S., but this probably is quite relevant to what you were saying. And this war, or these proxy wars with places like China or countries like Russia, are not exactly not being fought, because they're being fought underground in a lot of ways. Would you like to hear the sound?
Yeah, sure. Let's hear the sound.
Yeah, I'm going to get that on for you right now. He can explain this to you a little bit better, exactly what happens and how this works. Okay, I'm putting it up right now.
Okay.
China is pushing to try to gain supremacy in Latin America and up into the United States. I've been covering the immigration crisis here as people come through the Darien Gap on their way up to the United States. And one of the things we've seen in the last couple of months is a tremendous number of Chinese nationals coming through the Darien, going to the U.S., irregular migration to the United States. Now, they will tell you it's because of the COVID lockdowns and restrictions in China, but you remember that any Chinese citizen who comes to the United States or any other country, China still considers them to be under the laws of China, which means if they get a phone call that and China says, we want you to do something for us, they have to do it, or they and their family will suffer the consequence.
Well, I mean, that's a very good point, again, how China operates. And it also underlines the extent to which China is trying to infiltrate countries around the world. And there is a very interesting article today published by Gordon Chang. I've met Gordon Chang several times. He's a China expert. And this is on the a website I follow, which is called Gatestone Institute, Gatestone. I'll post this after the podcast on thetruthcentral.com. But what Gordon Chang is saying is that we could stop China's nuclear weapons development and other weapons programs. China is a relatively small economy and so is Russia compared to the United States, but yet they're growing and we're in economic difficulty. Yet the Chinese have their own economic difficulties. What Gordon Chang says, in reality, China's economy in 2020 probably contracted 3%. In other words, they've got negative growth. And that's right. If you'll pull that article up, it's the first one of the articles published today there you go. That's it. And so the Chinese basically have seen their exports fall because when the United States economic activity goes down, we're buying less from China. Remember, under these free trade agreements with China, we've largely sent our manufacturing to China. So China spent $240 billion on different country bailouts from 2008 to 2021. And that correlated with a drop in this Chinese lending for infrastructure projects. That's part of China's Belt and Road Initiative, which is part of their new Great Leap Forward to advance China economically and also exert China's influence around the world. But what Chang points out is that municipalities and cities across China have not been able to pay civil servant salaries and promise benefits for months. There are already protests even in wealthy cities like Wuhan, which is where the lab that really studies pathologies, viruses, etc., is located. The Wuhan lab has been the focus of a lot of controversy in the COVID issue. So there's a lot that we could do to stop China's fast buildup of its nuclear weapons if, in fact, we reduce the flow of cash to China. And President Reagan bankrupted the Soviet Union by reducing the flow of cash to Moscow. He did it at that time by getting the price of oil down to very, very low levels. As I recall, it was under $20 a barrel when he pushed it ultimately, largely by getting OPEC to increase its supply, and we increased our supply at that time. Of course, we were not producing oil in Reagan's years to the extent that we did under Trump. Under Trump, we regained our position as a net exporter of oil and natural gas. And we did not run out of oil, and there's no real reason to think we ever would run out of oil. At any rate, what Gordon Chang is saying is very reasonable. It makes a lot of sense to me, but the likelihood that it'll be done is pretty small because, again, you're in a situation where the United States is taking almost suicidal moves. We're worried much more about cultural issues that we're fighting over, whereas the economy, steps are being taken, even in the green initiatives, to reduce our use of hydrocarbon fuels, which is a suicidal measure. Our modern industrial state depends upon having cheap power. And here in the United States, we're only about to start experiencing the rise that's going to occur in the price of energy over the next few years. Again, the economics of the United States are fairly alarming when you understand the the future and the forecast here. In conclusion, I want to point out one more thing about the website. We're continuing to re-engineer the website and to advance it. We have on the website in the upper right-hand corner, you can see a lot of the places where we're broadcasting. You can see we have the podcasts up in the right-hand corner. You can also listen to us in audio. We posted now books. We have a tab with books with links to Amazon. I'm coming out with, I have 3 books that are in print right now. They're coming out into print. One is my follow-up to the Truth About Energy, Climate Change, and Global Warming. That one's doing extremely well. I'm going to be talking and writing about that a little bit later this week on some energy issues. I followed it up with the Truth About Neo-Marxism, Cultural Maoism, and Anarchy. That book will be out probably later this year, maybe closer to the fall. And ones that are yet to be posted but are done and get in production, I wrote a book with Dean Heskin, who is the CEO of Swiss America. And Dean and I are writing about the coming gold rush that's going to occur with the global economic downturn we anticipate in 2023. Also, thank you, Chris is showing you how the features of all the articles we're posting, different sections of the website. Really quite a lot of information on the website if you want to take some time to peruse it. And we are also having a book. I wrote a book with Chris Burries, who is, take a look at our sponsors, My Vital C, which is a remarkable molecule, carbon 60. I've been taking My Vital C products, which are carbon 60. It's a molecule with 60 carbon atoms and a cage structure like a geodesic dome or soccer ball, and it has remarkable longevity principles. I've been taking it for 4 years. I think it helps you in terms of feeling youthful, in terms of sleep, energy, mental facility, etc. And I've written a book with Chris, which will be out here again fairly soon, called Live Longer and Better. And we will be covering a lot on these issues. I'm creating a telemedicine site, getlongevitymeds.com, which is just in the process of preparing to launch. So there's going to be quite a lot on this website, and we're going to be podcasting every weekday on the variety of platforms where you can find us. And Chris, any final words before we wrap up?
Well, I can tell you this: I really love listening to the show on the podcast after it's done, because it's I'm an audio guy. I spent 25 years in radio, and I always loved listening to just the audio versions of something, because I like to imagine what's really going on in the studio. Video is awesome too. I love it. You can catch. We're going to be expanding the video as well. But if you ever get a chance and you're not able to watch the video sometime, pull us up on whichever audio channel you prefer. We have Apple Podcasts. We're also on Amazon Audible, Spreaker, Google Podcasts now. We have a lot more. Podchaser, GeoSawn, Castbox is picking us up as well. So you'll be heard on several formats. In fact, if you go to your Alexa and say, Alexa, play the Truth Central podcast, you'll be able to get us quite easily as well.
Thank you, Chris. And also we're publishing on YouTube and other channels some shorts, some just clips that you can see. We're also on TikTok doing the same. So we've got quite a social media presence this time around, and very enthusiastic about this program. And thank you for joining us. I always end by saying, in the end, God always wins. God will win here too. The world may go to war, but we'll pray that God intervenes and it's short, or that we get through these crises with intelligent leadership. That seems to be lacking at the moment. We seem to be in a period of mediocrity across the board, Republican and Democrat. And we'll be following the politics as we get into the election cycle, which will be getting serious here probably around late summer. So this is Dr. Jerome Corsi. Today is Monday, April 10th, 2023. Thank you for joining us. In the end, God always wins. We'll be back tomorrow.